We have all had those quilts come in that have completely wonky edges and are sort of what we refer to as bless her heart quilts. I'm sure you guys all know what I'm talking about. And I want to show you a way of dealing with that. And it tends to be the bottom edge is kind of where all the sins get pushed to. But you could use this technique on any part of the quilt. And so let's say this is what I had set up on the customer project, and we've stitched down to this point. And there's some real irregularities to the edges. And so I want to be very careful that the quilt turns out like I want it to, and I don't end up with, for instance, these traveling lines that will be in here inside the edges of the quilt. So what we'll do is we will use the push pin tool, and I'm going to use it with the mouse because I'm working on a hypothetical quilt here. It's not a real quilt. But you would normally use it from the machine head to click along the edges of the quilt. So I'll say start, and you could use your white button, your left handle button, or the place push pin on the screen. And so I would actually come along the actual edge of the quilt. So we're going to say that it comes way over here and then up here. And I'm going to make this extreme and then up this side. So you can click as many times as you need, and I'll say done. And so that gives me a push pin boundary, which by their definition is locked. It's not going to stitch out. It's just a reference as to where this very wonky quilt is on my table. So you have a couple of options. If it's a pattern that's not going to show too much, you can use the morph tool. So if I select these two rows, I could come into the morph icon here and distort it and try to get it to fit these areas. But this is really out of control, and you can see that it's really distorting these patterns. So that's not the ideal situation. So let's get back to that. This won't always be the case, but I've tossed in another little issue that you can run into, and that is that this quilt goes down below where the pattern was set up based on the measurements your customer gave you that you trusted. And so there's not actually pattern in here. If this ends up stitching, I'll move this down, you can see that this straight line is going to be in the center of their quilt, and we don't want that. So before we do the irregular edge trim, I will need to position to where there are patterns in this space, and the boundary is going to reposition along with the quilt pattern. So right now I'm going to say done, and I'm going to click on the boundary, right click and unlock it, and then go ahead and select it and delete it because it's going to move and it won't be useful to me when we do this reposition. So I'll also say remove all. So what I want to do is trick the computer and the machine, and I'm going to reposition to a higher row that's already stitched out. So I'll come up and select this one, and so that moved everything down and gives me plenty of patterns below where their quilt is. So then I'll go ahead and redo their wonky edges here. Start. You'd be doing this with the head. So we kind of came down here and had some boundary like that. That's indicating where their quilt is. So that I have patterns that will fill in, and then we can do the trim. So I'm going to go back to push pin boundary, and I'm going to use my computer mouse, not the head this time, because I can see where the edges of the quilt are on the quilt here. We have this, before I do that, we do have this one area where it comes out here, so I'll go ahead and pull those patterns. We'll assume that we've got enough pattern to fill that in. So now what I'm going to do is select the push pin, do it from the mouse, and say start, and I'm going to copy over my same points that I did from the machine head previously. And I can go up here, and then I'm going to come out beyond the patterns that I want to mask away. So let's say that and say done. So I've created another mask with my mouse that will cover everything I want to get rid of. And again, those masks are those push pin boundaries are locked. So what you need to do is actually touch the line, right click, and unlock it. and it will turn light red. Then if I select it to dark red and go to my mask tool, I'm going to say build, and it's going to turn that purple. And to utilize the mask, I have continuous sew and inside. I want the inside of this mask to cut away. So, but I have to select it again so it turns pink, and then select the pattern or patterns that I'm applying it to. In this case, it'll just be this bottom one, and say accept. And now if I go back to transform, I can actually just delete this lower row. But now that is going to stitch right along the edge of the quilt without distorting the pattern, which is much more preferable than using a morph tool and really pulling that pattern out of position. So just make sure when you do that, you have clicked right along the edge of their quilt, so you don't catch the edge as the machine comes back on, and that the traveling stitch will be covered by their binding.